The sound of my aunt's voice cutting through the hushed conversations at my grandfather's funeral reception will haunt me forever. Standing there in my black dress, still clutching the tissue I'd used during the service, I watched as she pointed directly at me and declared to a room full of relatives that I wasn't real family and had no business being there. What she didn't know was that in less than an hour, my lawyer would be reading a will that would change everything. My name is Elena Martinez, and this is the story of how I discovered that blood doesn't always make family, but love always does. The complicated history of my place in the Rodriguez family began 26 years ago when I was born to my mother, Sophia, who was then just 17 years old. My biological father had disappeared the moment he learned about the pregnancy, leaving my teenage mother to face the judgment and disappointment of her traditional Mexican-American family alone. My grandfather, Roberto Rodriguez, was a man whose life embodied the American dream in its purest form. He had arrived in California in 1962 as a 19-year-old immigrant from Guadalajara, Mexico, carrying nothing but a canvas bag with 2 changes of clothes and a letter of introduction to a distant cousin who worked construction in Los Angeles. Roberto's early years in America were defined by backbreaking labor and relentless determination. He worked on construction crews for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, sending most of his earnings back to his parents and siblings in Mexico while saving every penny he could for his own future. He lived in a boarding house with 6 other men, sleeping on a thin mattress in a room barely large enough for 2 people. But Roberto had vision that extended far beyond his circumstances. He spent his evenings studying English and his weekends observing how different construction projects were managed and executed. He learned to read blueprints by asking patient foremen to explain the symbols and measurements during lunch breaks. He studied business practices by watching how successful contractors interacted with clients and managed their crews. After 5 years of working for other people, Roberto had saved enough money to purchase a used pickup truck and a basic set of tools. He started taking small jobs that the larger construction companies didn't want, repairing fences, building small additions, doing handyman work for homeowners who needed reliable help at affordable prices. His reputation for honest work and fair prices spread through the immigrant community and beyond. Roberto never cut corners on materials or workmanship, even when doing so would have increased his profit margins. He understood that his reputation was his most valuable asset, something that couldn't be rebuilt once it was damaged. By 1970, Roberto had incorporated Rodriguez Construction and was employing 3 full-time workers. He had also married Maria Consuela Fernandez, a teacher's daughter from his hometown in Mexico who had come to California to join him after a courtship conducted primarily through letters. The business grew steadily throughout the 1970s and 1980s as Roberto's reputation for quality work spread throughout the region. He specialized in residential construction and commercial renovations, projects that required attention to detail and customer service rather than just raw efficiency. His crews were known for showing up on time, treating clients' property with respect, and completing projects within budget and on schedule. Roberto's success allowed him to purchase the sprawling ranch-style house where I would grow up, complete with the large backyard where he would later build that playground specifically for me. The house represented everything he had worked toward: stability, prosperity, and a place where his family could thrive for generations. By the time my mother Sophia was born in 1971, Roberto had become one of the most respected contractors in the area. He owned a fleet of trucks, employed 15 full-time workers, and had contracts with several major property developers. His success had also allowed him to bring several of his brothers and cousins from Mexico to work in his business, creating a network of family-based employment that strengthened both his company and his community connections. Roberto was indeed a stern man who believed deeply in hard work, family loyalty, and traditional values. He had earned his success through sacrifice and discipline, and he expected his children to approach their own lives with the same seriousness and dedication. He provided them with opportunities he had never had, good educations, stable homes, and the security that comes from financial stability, but he also expected them to appreciate these advantages and use them wisely. When my mother Sophia, his youngest daughter, showed up pregnant and unmarried at 17, it created a crisis that challenged everything Roberto believed about family, responsibility, and moral behavior. The pregnancy represented a failure of the values he had tried to instill in his children, and it threatened to bring shame on the family name he had worked so hard to establish in their community. The situation was complicated by the fact that Sofia had always been Roberto's favorite child. Carmen, Miguel, and David had been more cautious and conventional in their behavior, following the paths that Roberto had laid out for them without much creativity or independence. Sofia had been spirited and intelligent, asking questions that challenged Roberto's assumptions and pursuing interests that sometimes conflicted with his traditional expectations. Roberto had seen Sofia's independence as a sign of strength and potential, but now that same independence had led to what he viewed as a serious mistake that would have lasting consequences for her future and for the family's reputation in their conservative community. The crisis divided the entire extended family into camps of judgment and support. Some relatives argued that Sofia should be sent away to have the baby in secret, perhaps giving the child up for adoption to avoid the scandal of unwed motherhood. Others suggested that she should be forced to marry the father, regardless of his obvious unwillingness to accept responsibility for his actions. Roberto's initial reaction was a mixture of disappointment, anger, and protective instinct. He was deeply hurt that Sofia had made choices that contradicted everything he had taught her about responsibility and moral behavior. But he was also furious with the young man who had gotten his daughter pregnant and then abandoned her when she needed support the most. Most of all, Roberto was torn between his desire to maintain family honor and his unconditional love for Sofia. She was his daughter, regardless of her mistakes, and the idea of abandoning her in her time of greatest need was unthinkable to him. My mother's older siblings, Aunt Carmen, Uncle Miguel, and Uncle David, were all married with children of their own by then. They had followed the path that their father expected: good educations, stable careers, and respectable marriages that produced legitimate grandchildren who bore the Rodriguez name with pride. Sofia's pregnancy represented everything that Roberto thought he had raised his children to avoid. The shame of having an unwed teenage daughter was compounded by the fact that the father was someone Roberto had never even met, someone who refused to take responsibility for his actions. But rather than turning his back on his daughter and unborn grandchild, Roberto made a decision that surprised everyone, including Sofia herself. He told her that she and her baby would always have a home with him, that family meant supporting each other through difficult times, not abandoning each other when mistakes were made. This decision created immediate tension with Carmen, Miguel, and David, who felt that their father was enabling Sofia's irresponsible behavior. They argued that she should face the consequences of her choices, that helping her would only encourage her to continue making poor decisions. Roberto's response was simple and final. The baby was his grandchild, regardless of the circumstances of conception, and any grandchild of his would be raised with love, stability, and opportunity. He made it clear that anyone who couldn't accept this was welcome to distance themselves from the family, but they wouldn't be changing his mind. So I grew up in my grandfather's house, a sprawling ranch-style home that became the center of my universe for the first 18 years of my life. The house sat on 2 acres of beautifully landscaped property, with mature oak trees that provided shade during California's hot summers and a large backyard where Roberto had built an elaborate playground specifically for me when I turned 3. The playground wasn't just a simple swing set, it was a custom-designed adventure space that included a wooden fort with multiple levels, a tire swing that hung from the largest oak tree, monkey bars that Roberto had welded himself in his workshop, and a sandbox that he refilled with fresh sand every spring. He had spent months planning and building it, working on weekends and evenings to create something that would capture a child's imagination and provide years of safe entertainment. Roberto's attention to detail in building my playground reflected his approach to everything in his life. Every board was carefully measured and secured, every joint was reinforced beyond what was strictly necessary, and every surface was sanded smooth to prevent splinters. He painted the entire structure in bright primary colors that he repainted each year to keep it looking fresh and inviting. The house itself was a testament to Roberto's success and his commitment to providing his family with comfort and security. The living room featured a massive stone fireplace that Roberto had built himself, using stones he had personally selected from a quarry in the mountains. The kitchen was spacious and modern, with custom cabinets that Roberto had designed and installed to accommodate Maria's height and cooking preferences. My bedroom was on the main floor, next to Sofia's room and across the hall from Roberto and Maria's master suite. Roberto had converted what had originally been a home office into a nursery when I was born, installing built-in shelves for toys and books, a window seat with cushions where Sofia could sit while feeding me, and a ceiling fan with wooden blades that Roberto had carved with images of animals and flowers. As I grew older, Roberto updated my room to reflect my changing interests and needs. When I started school, he built a custom desk with drawers for art supplies and compartments for homework assignments. When I expressed interest in reading, he installed floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and made weekly trips to the library with me to select new books to add to my collection. My mother finished high school while Roberto hired Mrs. Esperanza Morales, a grandmother from their church congregation, to help care for me during the day. Mrs. Morales became like a second grandmother to me, teaching me traditional Mexican lullabies, showing me how to make tortillas from scratch, and telling me stories about her own childhood in a small village outside Guadalajara. The arrangement allowed Sofia to complete her education without the typical struggles that teenage mothers face. Roberto paid for private tutoring when Sofia fell behind in mathematics, hired a typing instructor to help her develop office skills, and covered all the costs associated with her high school graduation ceremony and celebration. Sofia went on to community college immediately after high school, pursuing a degree in nursing that would provide her with a stable career and the ability to help others. Roberto was proud of her choice, seeing healthcare as a noble profession that combined practical skills with genuine service to the community. The nursing program was demanding, requiring Sofia to balance classroom instruction with clinical rotations at local hospitals. Roberto adjusted his work schedule to accommodate her needs, often leaving construction sites early so he could pick me up from Mrs. Morales and handle bedtime routines while Sofia studied or worked late shifts at the hospital. Roberto never complained about the sacrifices he was making to support Sofia's education and our family's needs. He seemed to view these responsibilities as natural extensions of his role as a father and grandfather, opportunities to demonstrate the kind of unconditional love and support that had been missing from his own childhood in Mexico. When Sofia graduated from nursing school with honors and passed her state licensing examination, Roberto hosted a celebration party that rivaled some wedding receptions. He rented a banquet hall, hired a mariachi band, and invited everyone who had supported Sofia during her journey, classmates, instructors, clinical supervisors, and dozens of family friends and relatives. The party was Roberto's way of publicly acknowledging Sofia's achievement and demonstrating his pride in her transformation from teenage mother to licensed healthcare professional. He gave a speech that night about second chances, hard work, and the importance of family support in overcoming life's challenges. Sofia's success as a nursing student and new graduate validated Roberto's decision to support her rather than abandoning her when she needed help most. She had proven that teenage pregnancy didn't have to define or limit her potential, that with the right support and determination, she could build a meaningful career and provide a stable home for her daughter. All of this was accomplished while we lived under Roberto's protective wing, in a household where love and support were abundant even when money was sometimes tight. Roberto's construction business provided well for the family, but supporting an additional daughter and granddaughter while paying for Sofia's education represented a significant financial commitment that he never hesitated to make. Roberto wasn't just a grandfather to me. He was the father figure I never had. He taught me to ride a bike in his driveway, helped me with homework at his kitchen table, and attended every school play, soccer game, and graduation ceremony throughout my childhood. He spoke to me in Spanish and English, sharing stories about his own childhood in Mexico and the dreams that had brought him to America. My relationship with my aunts and uncles was complicated from the beginning. Carmen, the eldest, had always been the most vocal about her disapproval of my presence in the family. She had 3 children of her own who were several years older than me, and she never missed an opportunity to remind everyone that they were legitimate Rodriguez grandchildren while I was what she called an unfortunate circumstance. Miguel and David were less openly hostile, but they maintained a careful distance that made it clear I wasn't considered equal to their children in their eyes. Family gatherings were exercises in subtle exclusion, where my cousins would be included in conversations and activities while I was often overlooked or treated as an afterthought. The financial disparity was obvious to everyone, though Roberto tried to be discreet about it. While my aunts and uncles lived in modest homes and drove used cars, Roberto's success had afforded him luxuries that he generously shared with Sofia and me. We lived in his beautiful home, I attended private school, and I never wanted for anything that money could provide. This generosity created even more resentment among my relatives, who felt that Roberto was giving Sofia and me advantages that their own children didn't receive. Carmen frequently made comments about how convenient it must be for Sofia to never have to worry about rent or childcare, while she and her husband struggled to make ends meet despite both working full-time jobs. Roberto seemed oblivious to this tension, or perhaps he simply chose to ignore it. He had built his business through determination and sacrifice, and he felt entitled to spend his money however he chose. His philosophy was that family members should support each other's success rather than resenting it. As I grew older, I began to understand the complex dynamics that surrounded my existence. I realized that my very presence was a reminder of what my relatives saw as Sofia's failure and Roberto's favoritism. No matter what I accomplished or how well I behaved, I would always be the illegitimate grandchild who had disrupted their family's carefully ordered world. This understanding shaped my personality in ways that I'm still discovering today. I became an overachiever, determined to prove that I was worthy of the love and investment that Roberto had given me. I maintained perfect grades, participated in numerous extracurricular activities, and never gave anyone reason to question my character or work ethic. Roberto was proud of my achievements, but he also made it clear that his love wasn't conditional on my success. He loved me because I was his granddaughter, not because of anything I had accomplished. This unconditional acceptance was a gift that I didn't fully appreciate until much later in life. When I graduated as valedictorian of my high school class, Roberto hosted a party at his house that should have been a celebration but instead highlighted the ongoing family tensions. Carmen's children had been solid B students who went to state universities, while I had been accepted to Stanford with a partial academic scholarship. During the party, I overheard Carmen telling another relative that it was easy for me to excel academically when I didn't have to worry about working part-time jobs or helping support my family like her children did. The implication was that my success was somehow undeserved, a product of privilege rather than effort. Roberto must have heard the comment too, because he made a point of giving a speech that evening about how proud he was of all his grandchildren, but especially of my dedication and perseverance. He talked about how I had never let the circumstances of my birth define my potential, and how I represented the best of what the Rodriguez family could achieve. The speech was meant to be supportive, but it only seemed to deepen the resentment that my relatives felt toward me. I could see the eye rolls and exchanged glances that suggested they viewed Roberto's praise as further evidence of his favoritism. College provided a welcome escape from the family drama. At Stanford, I was just another student trying to make the most of an incredible educational opportunity. Nobody knew or cared about the circumstances of my birth, and I could finally focus on my own goals without constantly feeling like I had to justify my existence. I majored in business administration with a focus on international trade, inspired by Roberto's stories about building something meaningful from nothing. I spent summers interning at various companies, learning about different industries and developing skills that would serve me well in whatever career I eventually chose. Roberto visited me at school several times each year, always bringing Sofia along for what he called their college tours. He would take us to expensive restaurants and ask detailed questions about my classes, my professors, and my plans for the future. These visits were highlights of my college experience, reminders that I had people who believed in me unconditionally. During one of these visits, in my junior year, Roberto mentioned that he had been updating his estate planning and wanted to make sure that Sofia and I would be taken care of if anything happened to him. I told him that he didn't need to worry about such things, that he was going to be around for many more years. He smiled and said that he hoped I was right, but that a responsible man always planned for the future. He had built something valuable, and he wanted to make sure it would benefit the people he loved most. The conversation felt a bit morbid at the time, but I was touched by his concern for our welfare. After graduation, I moved back to the city where Roberto lived and found a job with a consulting firm that specialized in helping small businesses expand their operations. The work was challenging and rewarding, and it allowed me to use the knowledge I had gained in college while staying close to my grandfather, who was then in his early 70s. Roberto's health began to decline gradually over the next few years. He had always been a strong, vigorous man, but age and the physical demands of his work were beginning to take their toll. He started talking about retirement and succession planning for his construction company, conversations that inevitably involved discussions about family and legacy. I assumed that the business would eventually go to Miguel and David, who had both worked in construction for other companies and understood the industry. Carmen had become a school administrator and didn't seem interested in the day-to-day operations of building and contracting. Roberto never explicitly discussed his plans with me, but I got the impression that he was struggling with decisions about how to distribute his assets among his children and grandchildren. The family tensions that had existed since my birth had never really been resolved, and I think he was trying to find a way to be fair while also rewarding the relationships that meant the most to him. The signs of Roberto's failing health became more obvious during my late 20s. He was slowing down, delegating more responsibilities at work, and spending more time at home. Sophia and I tried to take care of him as much as he would allow, but he was proud and independent, reluctant to admit that he needed help with anything. Carmen, Miguel, and David began visiting more frequently during this period, something that Roberto seemed to enjoy despite the complicated history. I think he hoped that his illness might bring the family together, that facing his mortality would help everyone put their grievances into perspective. For a while, it seemed like his hope might be realized. Family dinners became more regular, and the conversations were less tense than they had been in previous years. My cousins, who were all adults with families of their own by then, seemed to be making an effort to include me in their discussions and activities. I later realized that this newfound warmth was probably motivated more by inheritance concerns than genuine affection, but at the time I was just grateful to feel like I might finally be accepted as a legitimate member of the family. Roberto passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, peacefully in his sleep after a brief battle with pneumonia. Sophia found him when she went to check on him before leaving for work, and the image of her standing in his bedroom doorway, crying and calling his name, will stay with me forever. The funeral arrangements fell primarily to Carmen, as the eldest child, and she approached the task with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that Roberto would have appreciated. She chose a beautiful casket, arranged for a service at the Catholic church where Roberto had worshipped for decades, and planned a reception at his house for after the burial. The service itself was a fitting tribute to a man who had touched many lives through his work, his generosity, and his commitment to family. The church was packed with employees from his construction company, clients whose homes and businesses he had built, and relatives who had traveled from across the country to pay their respects. I gave one of the eulogies, speaking about the grandfather who had raised me with love and wisdom, who had taught me that worth wasn't determined by circumstances but by character and effort. I talked about his immigrant journey, his business success, and most importantly, his unwavering commitment to the people he loved. The burial was smaller and more intimate, just family members standing around the gravesite as Roberto was laid to rest next to my grandmother, who had died when I was very young. It was a beautiful ceremony that honored his life while acknowledging the grief of his loss. The reception afterward started normally enough, with the kind of subdued but warm atmosphere that typically follows funeral services. Roberto's house, which had hosted so many family celebrations over the years, was filled once again with relatives, friends, and business associates who had come to pay their final respects and share memories of a man who had touched many lives. Carmen had arranged for the reception to be catered by a local Mexican restaurant that Roberto had frequented for decades. The dining room table was laden with his favorite foods, carnitas, rice and beans, fresh tortillas, and the tres leches cake that he always requested for special occasions. The familiar aromas filled the house, creating a bittersweet reminder of the countless family dinners we had shared around that same table. People moved through the rooms in small groups, their conversations a mixture of grief and celebration as they remembered Roberto's generosity, his work ethic, and his devotion to family. His longtime employees from the construction company had come directly from the burial service, still wearing their dress clothes but carrying themselves with the dignity that Roberto had always demanded from his crews. I found myself stationed near the kitchen, partly by chance and partly by design, accepting the condolences and memories that people wanted to share with someone who had been so close to Roberto. Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street told me about the time Roberto had rebuilt her front steps without charge after her husband died. Father Miguel from the church shared stories about Roberto's quiet charitable contributions that had helped dozens of families over the years. One of Roberto's oldest clients, a developer named Mr. Patterson who had worked with Roberto on numerous residential projects, spent several minutes telling me about my grandfather's reputation for integrity and craftsmanship. He said that Roberto's word had been worth more than most people's written contracts, and that he had never once regretted trusting Roberto with important projects. These conversations were comforting and meaningful, helping me understand the full scope of Roberto's impact on his community. He hadn't just been a successful businessman, he had been someone who used his success to lift up others, whether through employment opportunities, charitable giving, or simple acts of kindness that made people's lives a little easier. But as the afternoon progressed, I began to notice that the atmosphere in the main living room was changing. Carmen had positioned herself near the fireplace, the same spot where Roberto used to hold court during family gatherings, and she was surrounded by a growing circle of relatives who seemed to be engaged in an increasingly intense discussion. At first, I assumed they were sharing memories or discussing funeral arrangements, the kind of conversations that naturally occur when extended families gather after a loss. But as I moved closer while refilling my plate from the buffet table, I began to catch fragments of conversation that suggested something more complicated was taking place. Carmen's voice was becoming more animated and authoritative, the way it always did when she felt she was in a position to make important family decisions. She was speaking in the tone she had used when organizing holiday celebrations or mediating disputes between cousins, but there was an edge to her words that made me uncomfortable. I could hear references to inheritance, family assets, and the need to make decisions about Roberto's estate. Miguel and David were nodding along with their sister's comments, occasionally adding their own observations about property values and business operations. Some of the other relatives were listening intently, clearly aware that significant financial matters were being discussed. The conversation seemed to be building towards some kind of conclusion or announcement, and I realized that Carmen was preparing to make a statement that she considered important enough to address to the entire gathering. She was looking around the room, making eye contact with key family members as if seeking their agreement or support for whatever she was about to say. I was standing near the kitchen entrance, holding a plate of food that I no longer had any appetite for, when Carmen's voice rose above the general conversation and caught the attention of everyone in the room. The change in volume and tone was dramatic enough to cause other conversations to stop, and within moments, the entire reception had focused their attention on whatever Carmen was preparing to announce. That's when I heard her say my name, followed by words that felt like a physical blow to my chest and stomach. The room, which had been filled with the warm buzz of conversation and shared memories, suddenly became completely silent as everyone processed what Carmen had just said. Carmen was holding court near the fireplace, surrounded by several relatives including Miguel and David. I couldn't hear everything she was saying, but her voice was getting louder and her gestures more animated. Other people in the room were starting to pay attention to her monologue. I moved closer, curious about what could be causing such a stir at what was supposed to be a somber gathering. That's when I heard her say my name, followed by words that felt like a physical blow. According to Carmen, Roberto's death meant that the real Rodriguez family could finally move forward without the complications that had been created by Sofia's mistake 26 years ago. She said that while she had nothing personal against me, the time had come to acknowledge that I wasn't really a Rodriguez, that I had no biological connection to Roberto's legacy. She talked about how Roberto's generosity towards Sofia and me had been admirable but misguided, how it had created confusion about family boundaries that needed to be clarified now that he was gone. She said that the house, the business, and other family assets should rightfully go to Roberto's legitimate children and grandchildren. The room had gone completely quiet by this point. Everyone was looking back and forth between Carmen and me, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. I felt frozen, unable to process what I was hearing or formulate any kind of response. Carmen continued, her voice growing more confident as she realized that nobody was interrupting her. She said that she understood I might have expected to inherit something from Roberto, but that I needed to be realistic about my place in the family structure. I was Sofia's daughter, not Roberto's granddaughter in any legal sense that mattered. She suggested that it would be best for everyone if I accepted this reality gracefully, rather than creating drama or pursuing claims that would only cause pain and division among the people who were genuinely bereaved by Roberto's loss. The cruelty of choosing Roberto's funeral reception to deliver this message was breathtaking, but Carmen seemed to feel that she was performing a necessary service for the family. She was establishing boundaries that should have been clear all along, preventing future misunderstandings about inheritance and belonging. I stood there in my black dress, surrounded by people who had just watched me give a eulogy about the man who raised me, listening to my aunt explain why I didn't deserve to be there. The humiliation was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the grief of losing Roberto and now having his love for me questioned in front of our entire extended family. Sophia was standing across the room, her face pale with shock and anger. I could see that she wanted to defend me, but she was as stunned as I was by the audacity of Carmen's timing and the cruelty of her words. That's when I remembered something Roberto had told me during one of our last conversations. He had mentioned updating his will and making sure that Sophia and I would be taken care of. He had also given me the business card of his attorney, James Morrison, and told me to call him if I ever needed legal advice about anything. I excused myself from the room, went to Roberto's study, and called Mr. Morrison from the phone on his desk. I explained who I was and what had just happened at the reception. I asked if he could come to the house and clarify exactly what Roberto's will said about his estate distribution. Mr. Morrison said he had been planning to schedule a formal reading of the will for later that week, but given the circumstances, he could come over immediately. He said he always carried copies of his client's important documents, and he happened to be nearby. While I waited for the lawyer to arrive, I stood in Roberto's study looking at the photographs on his desk. There were pictures of all his grandchildren, but the largest frame held a photo of him and me at my Stanford graduation. He was wearing his best suit and the proudest smile I had ever seen, his arm around my shoulders as we posed in front of the university's iconic entrance. Looking at that photograph, I remembered all the times Roberto had told me that I was his granddaughter in every way that mattered. He had never treated me differently from his other grandchildren, never suggested that my legitimacy was questionable or conditional. Mr. Morrison arrived about 20 minutes later, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that suggested he understood the gravity of the situation. I met him at the front door and explained that Carmen had just finished telling a room full of relatives that I wasn't real family and had no claim to Roberto's estate. He shook his head and said that Roberto had been very specific about his wishes regarding his estate distribution. He had updated his will just 6 months ago, and there would be no ambiguity about his intentions once the document was read aloud. We walked into the living room together, where the reception was still in progress but the mood had become uncomfortable. Carmen was still holding court, but the energy had shifted as people began to realize that something significant was happening. Mr. Morrison introduced himself to the room and explained that he was Roberto's attorney. He said that while he had planned to schedule a formal will reading for later in the week, recent events had made it necessary to clarify Mr. Rodriguez's final wishes immediately. Carmen looked pleased, apparently confident that the will reading would validate everything she had just said about family boundaries and inheritance rights. Miguel and David moved closer, clearly interested in hearing the details of their father's estate distribution. Mr. Morrison opened his briefcase and removed a thick document bound in blue covers. He explained that this was Roberto's last will and testament, executed 6 months ago and properly witnessed and notarized according to California state law. He began by reading the standard legal language that appears at the beginning of most wills, establishing Roberto's identity and mental competence at the time of signing. Then he moved to the specific bequests, starting with smaller gifts to various friends and employees. Roberto had left money to several of his long-term employees, including his foreman who had worked with him for over 20 years. He had made charitable donations to the church where his funeral had been held and to a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in construction and engineering. Then Mr. Morrison reached the section that dealt with family members. Roberto had left $50,000 each to Miguel and David, acknowledging their status as his sons and expressing hope that the money would help them with their own family's needs. Carmen had been left $25,000, a smaller amount that reflected Roberto's disappointment with her attitude towards Sophia and me over the years, though the will didn't explicitly state this reasoning. Each of Roberto's legitimate grandchildren, Carmen's, Miguel's, and David's children, had been left $10,000 to be held in trust until they reached age 25. So far, the distribution seemed fairly conventional, if perhaps smaller than what some family members might have expected. Roberto's construction business was valuable, his house was worth several $100,000, and his various investments and savings accounts represented a substantial estate. Mr. Morrison paused before continuing, looking around the room at the faces of people who were clearly doing mental calculations about what remained to be distributed. Then he read the section that changed everything. Roberto had left his house, his construction business, and the remainder of his estate, valued at approximately $2.8 million, to Sofia Rodriguez Martinez and her daughter, Elena Martinez. The will specifically stated that they were his beloved daughter and granddaughter, and that they had brought him more joy and pride than any parent or grandparent could reasonably expect to experience. The room erupted in shocked silence, followed by Carmen's voice rising in disbelief and anger. She demanded to see the document, insisting that there must be some mistake or fraud involved. How could Roberto have left virtually everything to Sofia and me while giving his other children and grandchildren what amounted to token amounts? Mr. Morrison calmly handed her the will and explained that Roberto had been very clear about his reasoning. He had included a personal letter to be read after the estate distribution was announced, and perhaps that would help the family understand his decision-making process. Carmen was frantically flipping through the pages of the will, looking for some clause or condition that would invalidate what she had just heard. Miguel and David were staring at each other in shock, clearly trying to process the financial implications of Roberto's decision. Mr. Morrison retrieved a sealed envelope from his briefcase and opened it carefully. He explained that Roberto had written this letter specifically to be read at the will reading, as a way of explaining his choices to family members who might be surprised by them. The letter began with Roberto expressing his love for all his children and grandchildren, and his hope that they would remember him fondly despite any disappointment they might feel about his estate distribution. But then he became more specific about his reasoning. He wrote that over the 26 years since my birth, he had watched his family's reaction to Sofia and me with growing disappointment and concern. He had hoped that time would heal the divisions created by my illegitimate status, but instead he had seen those divisions deepen and harden. He wrote about overhearing conversations where Carmen, Miguel, and David discussed their resentment about the advantages he had given Sofia and me. He knew that they viewed his generosity toward us as favoritism that came at their expense, and he had tried for years to bridge that gap through his own actions and words. But Roberto had concluded that the problem wasn't his favoritism, it was his other children's inability to accept Sofia and me as legitimate family members deserving of love and support. He wrote that he had been particularly hurt by Carmen's constant comments about my illegitimate status and her suggestions that I didn't deserve the same opportunities as her children. The letter explained that Roberto had built his business and accumulated his wealth through decades of hard work and sacrifice. He felt entitled to leave his assets to the people who had brought him the most happiness and who had shown him the most genuine love and respect. Sofia had been a devoted daughter who had overcome the challenges of teenage pregnancy to build a successful career while raising me with values that Roberto admired. I had been a granddaughter who appreciated the opportunities he provided and who had worked hard to justify his investment in my education and future. In contrast, his other children had spent years viewing his success as something they were entitled to inherit rather than something they needed to earn through their own character and behavior. They had treated Sofia and me as obstacles to their inheritance rather than fellow family members deserving of love and acceptance. Roberto wrote that he hoped his final decision would send a clear message about what he valued most: family members who supported each other unconditionally, rather than family members who calculated the financial implications of every relationship. He concluded by saying that Sofia and I had never asked him for anything beyond his love and acceptance, while his other children had spent years positioning themselves for maximum inheritance benefit. His will was simply a reflection of who had earned his respect and gratitude through their actions rather than their expectations. When Mr. Morrison finished reading the letter, the silence in the room was deafening. Carmen was sitting in a chair with the will still in her hands, her face cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and disbelief. Miguel and David looked like they were still trying to process what they had heard. Some of the other relatives began gathering their belongings and making quiet exits, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama that was unfolding. The reception that had started as a celebration of Roberto's life had turned into something much more complicated and painful. I stood there holding Sofia's hand, trying to absorb the magnitude of what had just happened. In the space of 2 hours, I had gone from being told I wasn't real family to learning that I was the primary beneficiary of a multi-million-dollar estate. But more important than the money was the validation that Roberto's love for me had been genuine and unconditional. His will and letter were his final statement about what our relationship had meant to him, and no amount of resentment from other family members could diminish that gift. Carmen finally stood up and approached me, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. She said that this wasn't over, that there had to be legal grounds for challenging a will that was so obviously unfair and vindictive. Mr. Morrison intervened before I could respond, explaining that Roberto had been mentally competent when he signed the will, that it had been properly executed according to state law, and that the letter demonstrated clear reasoning for his decisions. Any legal challenge would be expensive and unlikely to succeed. He also mentioned that Roberto had anticipated the possibility of a will contest and had included a clause stating that any beneficiary who challenged the will's validity would forfeit their entire inheritance. Carmen, Miguel, and David would lose even their smaller bequests if they pursued legal action. This information seemed to deflate some of Carmen's anger, though I could see that she was still processing the financial and emotional implications of Roberto's final decision. She had spent years positioning herself as the family matriarch, assuming that she would inherit the primary responsibility for Roberto's legacy along with the bulk of his assets. Instead, she had discovered that her father viewed her as someone who had failed to understand the most basic principles of family loyalty and acceptance. The money was important, but the judgment implicit in Roberto's will was probably even more devastating. As the remaining relatives began to leave, Sophia and I were left alone with Mr. Morrison to discuss the practical implications of our inheritance. The house we had been living in was now legally ours, along with a construction business that generated substantial annual revenue and various investment accounts that Roberto had built up over decades of careful financial planning. Mr. Morrison explained that there would be estate taxes to pay and various legal procedures to complete before we could fully access our inheritance. He would guide us through the process and help us understand our new responsibilities as business owners and property holders. But he also warned us that the family tensions revealed at the will reading were unlikely to disappear quickly. Carmen, Miguel, and David would need time to process their disappointment and resentment, and we should be prepared for potential ongoing conflicts about Roberto's final decisions. Over the following weeks and months, the predictions about family tensions proved accurate. Carmen made several attempts to find legal grounds for challenging the will, hiring attorneys who ultimately confirmed what Mr. Morrison had told us about the document's validity and Roberto's mental competence. Miguel and David were less openly hostile, but they maintained a careful distance that made it clear they viewed our inheritance as an injustice that had deprived their own children of opportunities they deserved. Some of the extended family members chose sides, creating divisions that extended beyond Roberto's immediate children and grandchildren. Family gatherings became awkward affairs where people were careful about what they said and who they associated with. But Sophia and I also discovered unexpected sources of support among relatives who had witnessed the years of subtle discrimination we had faced and who felt that Roberto's final decision was a justified response to treatment that had never been fair or appropriate. The construction business required immediate attention, and I found myself thrust into a leadership role that I had never expected to occupy. Roberto had built the company around his own expertise and relationships, and his death created challenges that had to be addressed quickly to maintain client confidence and employee morale. I threw myself into learning everything I could about the construction industry, working with Roberto's longtime foremen and project managers to understand how the business operated. My business education proved valuable in analyzing financial statements and developing strategic plans, but I had to rely heavily on experienced employees who understood the practical aspects of building and contracting. The immediate aftermath of the will reading was chaotic and emotionally charged. Carmen spent the next several hours making phone calls to various attorneys, desperately seeking someone who would tell her that Roberto's will could be successfully challenged. She was convinced that there had to be some legal technicality or procedural error that would invalidate a document that seemed so contrary to her expectations. Miguel and David were more subdued in their reactions, but I could see them having intense whispered conversations in corners of the house as they tried to process the financial implications of Roberto's decision. They had both been counting on substantial inheritances to help with their own children's college expenses and retirement planning. The extended family members who had witnessed the confrontation began leaving quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama that had erupted at what was supposed to be a solemn gathering. Some offered me awkward congratulations mixed with condolences, unsure how to respond to such an unexpected turn of events. Sophia was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had happened. She had known that Roberto loved and valued us, but she had never imagined that his final gesture would be so decisive and comprehensive. She kept looking at the will documents as if she expected them to change or disappear, unable to fully believe that our financial worries were suddenly over. The practical implications of our inheritance became apparent over the following weeks and months. Roberto's construction business required immediate attention and decision-making to maintain client relationships and employee confidence. The company had several major projects underway, and there were contracts and deadlines that couldn't be postponed while we figured out our new responsibilities. I found myself thrust into a leadership role that I had never expected to occupy, working closely with Roberto's longtime foreman, Carlos Mendoza, who had been with the company for over 15 years. Carlos had deep knowledge of the construction industry and strong relationships with both clients and subcontractors, but he lacked the business education and financial background needed to manage the company's growth and strategic planning. Together, we formed an effective partnership that combined his practical expertise with my academic training in business administration. I handled contracts, financial planning, and client relationships while Carlos managed the day-to-day operations on job sites. We instituted weekly planning meetings and monthly financial reviews that helped us maintain the quality standards that Roberto had established while improving efficiency and profitability. The transition wasn't without challenges. Some clients were initially skeptical about working with a young woman who had limited experience in construction, and we had to prove ourselves project by project. But Roberto's reputation for integrity and quality work provided a foundation of trust that helped us navigate those early months. Within a year, we had not only maintained the company's existing client base but had actually expanded into new markets and service areas. We started offering design consultation services in addition to construction, and we developed specializations in energy-efficient building techniques and sustainable materials that attracted environmentally conscious clients. The financial success of the business allowed us to increase wages for our employees and provide better benefits, including health insurance and retirement contributions that Roberto had wanted to offer but hadn't been able to afford. The money from Roberto's estate also allowed Sophia to retire from nursing and focus on managing the rental properties that were part of our inheritance. She had worked tirelessly for decades to support us both, and being able to provide her with financial security was one of the most satisfying aspects of our changed circumstances. We used part of our inheritance to establish the Roberto Rodriguez Memorial Scholarship Fund, which provides financial assistance to students from immigrant families who are pursuing careers in construction, engineering, or business. The fund reflects Roberto's belief in the importance of education and opportunity while honoring his own journey from Mexican immigrant to successful American businessman. The scholarship program has become one of our most meaningful projects, allowing us to support young people who face challenges similar to what Roberto experienced when he first arrived in California. We've helped dozens of students complete their education and launch successful careers, creating a living memorial to Roberto's values and aspirations. Carmen, Miguel, and David eventually stopped their legal challenges and began the slow process of rebuilding their relationship with Sophia and me. It was a gradual and sometimes painful journey, complicated by years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding that couldn't be resolved overnight. Carmen seemed to struggle the most with accepting the new family dynamics. She had spent decades viewing herself as Roberto's primary heir and the natural leader of the next generation, and adjusting to our changed circumstances required her to fundamentally reconsider her role and expectations. The process was made more difficult by her public humiliation at the funeral reception, where her assumptions about inheritance and family hierarchy had been so dramatically contradicted. But even Carmen began to acknowledge that Roberto's decision, while painful for her, reflected patterns of behavior that she could recognize in retrospect. The casual cruelty of her comments at his funeral reception became a source of genuine regret that she eventually expressed directly to me during a private conversation about a year after his death. She admitted that she had spent so many years resenting Roberto's support for Sophia and me that she had lost sight of the values he was trying to teach about family loyalty and unconditional love. Miguel and David were more willing to accept Roberto's reasoning, though they remained disappointed by the financial implications of his final decision. They came to understand that their inheritance, while smaller than they had expected, was still substantial enough to make a meaningful difference in their families' lives. More importantly, They began to recognize that their resentment about Roberto's support for Sofia and me had created distance in their relationships with him that they now regretted. The younger generation, my cousins who had been children when the family tensions began, proved more adaptable to the new circumstances. Many of them had never fully understood the source of the divisions that had defined their family gatherings, and Roberto's death created an opportunity to build relationships based on current realities rather than historical grievances. Several of my cousins have worked for our construction company during summer breaks from college, and others have benefited from the scholarship fund that we established in Roberto's memory. These positive interactions have helped heal some of the wounds that were created during my childhood and have laid the foundation for healthier family relationships in the future. Looking back now, several years after Roberto's funeral and the dramatic will reading that followed, I can see that his final decision accomplished exactly what he intended. He forced the family to confront the prejudices and resentments that had been simmering for decades, and he demonstrated that love and acceptance would be rewarded while discrimination and hostility would be rejected. The money was important, but the real inheritance was the validation that Sofia and I belonged in the Rodriguez family not because of blood relationships or legal documents, but because we had earned Roberto's love through our character and behavior. His will was his final statement about what he valued most in family relationships: loyalty, love, and mutual support rather than genetic connections or social conventions. Carmen's declaration at the funeral reception that I wasn't real family had been intended to establish boundaries that would exclude me from Roberto's legacy. Instead, it had prompted a will reading that proved exactly the opposite, that Roberto considered me family in the most meaningful sense possible. The construction business continues to thrive under our management, and we've expanded into new areas while maintaining the commitment to quality and community service that Roberto established. We now employ over 30 people and have become one of the largest minority-owned construction companies in our region, an achievement that I know would have made Roberto proud. The scholarship fund has helped dozens of students pursue their educational goals, creating a living memorial to Roberto's belief in the transformative power of opportunity. Each year, we host a dinner where scholarship recipients can share their stories and connect with others who have benefited from the program. Most importantly, the family divisions that had defined my childhood have largely healed, replaced by relationships based on mutual respect rather than resentment or prejudice. Roberto's final lesson was that family is about the people who choose to love and support each other, not just the people who happen to share genetic material. Standing in his study today, looking at that same photograph of our Stanford graduation, I can still feel Roberto's pride and love. He gave me many gifts during his lifetime: education, opportunity, and unconditional acceptance. But his greatest gift was the final demonstration that I had always been his real granddaughter in every way that truly mattered. The sound of Carmen's voice at that funeral reception will always remind me of how painful it feels to have your belonging questioned by people who should accept you unconditionally. But the sound of Mr. Morrison reading Roberto's will reminds me that love and acceptance can triumph over prejudice and resentment, even when that triumph comes at the end of a life well lived. Roberto's legacy lives on not just in the business he built or the money he left behind, but in the lesson he taught about what it really means to be family. That lesson was worth more than any inheritance, though I'm grateful to have received both. Every day that I walk through the offices of Rodriguez Construction or review applications for our scholarship fund, I'm reminded that real family isn't about blood or birth certificates. It's about the people who choose to love, support, and believe in each other no matter what challenges life brings.